Well, hey, what's up, Resonate? I'm so glad that you are here. We are starting a new series called Confident, and I know that you who are freshmen are like, man, that is perfect timing because I need a little bit of that right now. Just entered into this new context, but this is what we're asking. This is what we're kind of getting into, is we're trying to figure out what you put your confidence in. What is it that you put your trust in? What is it that you can trust? Is it people? Is it truth? Is it the way that the world works, or like kind of this way that you understand the world? Maybe it's yourself. Maybe it's like, hey, I only trust me and what I can do. And maybe you've met that person who trusts themselves just a little too much, right? They're that kind of overconfident person, and they're just, we've interacted with those people, and like they come out and they're wearing that thing, and you're like, really? That's a lot of confidence right there. And maybe not a whole lot of friends, and no mirrors, definitely, And so this is kind of that moment where we begin to say, okay, what is it that we put our trust in? And when it comes to God, here's the thing, that oftentimes when we begin to kind of see what is it that we put our confidence in, here's what the Bible calls that. It calls that faith. And that faith is something that is bigger than just a religious term. It's bigger than just a term we find in the Bible. It's really the way that you understand the world and kind of how you see the world interact and how it works. And so as you begin to think about this, you begin to have things that you put your faith in, that you put your confidence in. And whether you know it or not, this is kind of the way that you operate with life. That you kind of have this thing, and as you become an adult, you kind of understand that this is how the way works. This is what how the world works. This is what I can put my trust in. This is kind of how the equation works. If I do this, these outcomes happen. And as you begin to think about this and you begin to understand what it looks like, this is so important for you to understand, because this is kind of underneath every decision that you make. So if I was to ask you, hey, how does the world work? You could begin to say, well, I believe this, or I've always assumed this. And underneath those are faith statements. Those are the context of what you put your hope, your trust in. This is what you're thinking. This is how I understand the world. And for you to understand that you operate in faith, that you operate with this. And so let me just start off. This is like an overly simple thing. Like when you came in and you sat down on the seat, you put your faith in this idea that this seat was going to hold you. You probably didn't think, I don't know this for sure. I need to test this. But you have some kind of shortcut that you have to say, most chairs hold me up. And when I don't have a chair that holds me up, that chair betrays me, right? And so this is kind of how you operate, that you have faith in this. Or maybe you have faith that, man, if you work hard at something, the outcome is going to be that you get successful at that. Or maybe, the way the world works, that if I have relationships with powerful people, that's going to be something that ultimately benefits me. And that's just kind of this thing that we have confidence in, the thing that we have faith in, the thing that we put our hope in. And as we think about this really is the holistic understanding of your belief system. And this is not just God. This is just the way that you believe the world. And I want you to get this, that there is a force at work that is hoping to shape and is working to shape your belief system, to shape what you put your confidence in. Here's what I want you to get, that God's primary goal for you is to grow your confidence in Him. That God's primary goal for you is for you to grow your confidence in Him, to grow your faith in Him. And so in all the things that you're doing and all the ways that you're kind of processing the world and trying to figure out what works, there is an underlying theme happening that God is pursuing you, and He is pursuing building your faith, and you don't even know it yet. But this is one of the realities. And one of the things that we believe about Resonate Church is that this is a part of a movement, that we believe that God is doing something that's significant, that's bigger than any one of us. But we begin to see that there's something happening, and that's kind of the core understanding of Resonate Church. And Steve Addison says this. He wrote a book called Movements That Change the World. And he says one of the primary components, or the first component of really movements that change the world, is this idea of white hot faith. And this is like this key understanding of this idea that us having clarity and having confidence in something is really the beginning of changing the world. And what I love about your generation is this, that I really believe that you want to do something great with your life. And having confidence in something and clarity at something, it goes against what we normally see in the world. A world that's filled with insecurity, a world that is filled with confusion. And as we begin to think about, for you to understand what is underneath this, for you to understand how you have clarity in the world, what you have your confidence in, and how you build that, it's going to set you apart. And these are these people that when people start movements, they're set apart kind of people. They're not the normal kind of people in a culture because they have an uncanny confidence. They have this deep expectation of the world around them. And this is how they begin to live their life with boldness. And as you begin to understand this, and as you begin to process this, I want you to get God is at work. And you might say, it seems to me, Keith, if this is what God's primary goal is, that God is not very good at his goal. Because maybe you're sitting here and you would say, hey, if I'm really honest, I'm having doubts about this whole faith thing. I'm having doubts about this whole God thing. And I'm having these moments where I'm trying to figure out just exactly what I believe about that. Maybe you showed up because you're all over the place. And you're like, maybe if I just show up at church, maybe something good, maybe God will see me here and something good will work out because I don't have confidence right now. And you see these people who have once followed and had this white hot faith and now they're not that way anymore. Over the last 11 years, as I've been a pastor of Resonate Church, there's been, to our knowledge, about 18,000 college students that have come through Resonate Church at some level with our small groups called Villages. And in this, we've seen out of all those people, we've seen some incredible stories. Like stories, you can go on our website and you can see all these baptism stories and people tell their story of this is who I was and God radically transformed my life. And we've seen people that just were one way and God just broke into their life and rewrote their story, transformed their story. They're not the same person. All these things that held them down in bondage were no longer the same. And we see this over and over and over. But in some of them, that happened. But if you were to look at their life now, you'd see them shipwrecked, like that some of them might not even believe in God. And you begin to say, how does that happen where you have this radical transformation, where you have this white hot faith, where you have this really clear and confident way of living your life, and then all of a sudden something happens and you lose your faith. Something happens and you shipwreck your faith. What's underneath that? How does that happen? And I want to get into this because it's really clear and very key that you understand how it is that people lose their faith and how it is that faith works, because it's the mechanism by which you make your decisions in your life. And if you don't understand what's underneath those decisions, you're going to be basically kind of moving with the wind and you're not going to be rooted and anchored in something. So let me help you understand this, that when it comes to faith, and when it comes to people who have operated by faith and it seems like they have lost their faith, I want you to get this truth. It has everything to do with the foundations of their faith, what their faith is built upon. If somehow they've shipwrecked their faith, if somehow they've lost their faith, it has everything to do with the foundation that they've put as their faith, or say it another way, what they've leaned their faith against. What it is that is supporting their faith, it has everything to do with what their faith is built upon. It makes all the difference. The difference in you living a life that has the capacity to start a movement, that has the capacity to do something with, just incredible, to have white hot faith, and the kind of faith that is ended up shipwrecked is really what it is founded upon. The problem is, I want you to get this, that there's an overwhelming propensity for people to build their faith on the wrong thing. It is radically easy to do. And I would say in this room, there's many of you who unknowingly have built your faith on something that you don't realize is something that will fail you. And here's what happens. It's all fine when life is going good. But when the thing happens, when the major event comes in your life and you need something to lean on, right? You need a foundation to stand on. And when that foundation, you begin to lean on your faith and it moves, and your faith craters, that's when you begin to realize, oh, I thought I had a faith in this, and it failed me. And this is why people leave the faith with bitter feelings about this, because they put their faith on the wrong thing. And here's the thing, as we look at this, and over the last 11 years, as we've seen people come into Resonate, graduate, go out, and we see people who have their faith eroded, that once had a white-hot faith and something happened to them, there's two key things that begin to stick out in terms of how we begin to see faith that gets shipwrecked. One is this, it's lifestyle decisions. And the other one is this, it's unmet expectations or unfulfilled expectations. These are the two things that I've seen shipwreck faith. These are the two things that I've seen just erode faith. And let me tell you a little bit more about what this is about. Let's start with this lifestyle decision. Here's what a lifestyle decision is. It's when we begin to change what we believe because of a lifestyle decision. When we begin to change what we believe because of a decision that we made with our behavior. And here's how this works, that we begin to change something, and it's not because we've done all this research. It's not because, man, I just began to research Christianity, and there's just some things that are very difficult to understand, and I just couldn't put my hope in that because I began to think through all of this, and it was really difficult to absolutely trust this. It's never that. It's never I did all the research and arrived that I can't put my hope in Christianity. It's this. I got around this group of people. I entered into this context that I believed this one thing, and then what changed was my circumstances. What changed was my context. And it goes like this. You begin to enter into this context in your life, and you have this belief. And all of a sudden, you begin to enter into a friend group, and they have a different set of beliefs, and it seems like you're the only one, right? And then all of a sudden, it seems like you begin to have a behavior that begins to mimic the normative behavior of the context you're in, and then suddenly you begin to recognize, oh, I'm shifting my beliefs to fit my behavior. You have beliefs about dating. You have beliefs about this is how healthy dating should be. And then she shows up, right? And then all the temptation shows up, and all of a sudden you've changed your behavior, and then you go back. We see it all the time. Oh, this is now what I believe because I was tempted by this lifestyle decision to make this choice, and now it begins to then affect the way I believe, and it erodes my faith, and all of a sudden I don't want to follow in Jesus anymore. Why? Because she showed up and temptation showed up, and you thought this is the way that I should live. Your behavior changes your belief. It looks like this. You have a belief about the dignity of women, and then you enter into an environment where porn is just a normative reality, and then your behavior begins to change, and it begins to change your beliefs, and then before too long, you're heading towards giving a girl a Me Too moment. It begins to change your behavior, right? That your behavior begins to change your belief, that you enter into a job, and you begin to realize that all around you there are people who the normative way is to lie to get ahead, and you grew up and you have this kind of clarity that this is the moral way to live, and then all of a sudden you begin to get in this and you begin to say, I guess this tension of how I should live my life, the only way to resolve this is begin to behave like everyone else behaves, and what happens is that affects the way that you believe, and your faith is eroded. This is textbook. This is how people have their faith shipwrecked. The other thing is this, it's not just I'm getting, these lifestyle decisions, it's these unfulfilled expectations. And here's how this looks like. That you have an idea of how God should behave. That you have an idea of this is how God should act. And if I do A, B, C, then God will do D, E, and F. And that when God doesn't behave the way God should behave, that you prayed this prayer, right? And it didn't seem like God answered the prayer. And those expectations are unfulfilled, that you needed this thing to work out in your life. And so you went and by faith you prayed. And then all of a sudden it didn't seem like God moved on your behalf. And so all of a sudden you're like, where was God? I guess God doesn't exist. I guess this thing isn't worth my trust and my confidence in this thing, that there's a sickness in my family, and we prayed that God would heal them, and they ended up dying or they ended up suffering, that there's this thing that needs to change, right? And all of a sudden, you begin to have an expectation that if I do this, then God should do his part, and God's not behaving like you think God is to behave. And if you were to put these two things together, and if we were just to kind of label this thing, that if you're talking about the pleasures of this life and the pressures of this life, that faith built on the pleasures of life and the pressures of life is ultimately circumstantial faith. That if your faith is built upon the pleasures of life, the lifestyle decisions, and the pressures of life, the unmet expectation that when there's something in a bind and you need God to show up and it doesn't seem like he shows up, that when this happens, what you begin to see is that you have created what we are going to call a circumstantial faith. A circumstantial faith. And circumstantial faith is this: it's trusting in God based upon your ability to find him in your circumstances. I want you to get that. It's trusting in God based upon your ability to find him in your circumstances. That you would say, my trust is tied to, here's the algorithm, here's the kind of the way it works, here's the formula, that my trust is based upon my ability to find God in my circumstances. And to some extent, we all have this, that we begin to lean our faith up against the circumstances of our life. And this is kind of what forms our faith. And this is kind of how we begin to understand the world. I want you to get this, that when our faith leans against our experiences, circumstantial faith becomes very, very fragile. You see, circumstantial faith is it's always incredibly fragile. Here's why. There is a randomness to life, and there's a seemingly randomness to God. And when we begin to put this together, we begin to have a kind of faith that doesn't stay white hot, that doesn't lead us to do something that changes the world, that doesn't lead us to having confidence and clarity in our life and to be able to know what we are founded in and be able to have a firm foundation. We begin to have this faith that begins to have all these things that happen, and we don't know how to process it, and ultimately it's a very fragile way to live. And so people come in, and then something happens, but the reality is that they put their faith upon the circumstances or their ability to see God in their circumstances, and it began to erode the first moment it began to go awry. And here's the reason it's fragile. Here's the truth, that you and I aren't very good at interpreting the circumstances of our life. We're just not. We're not very good at looking in our life and being able to say, here's what's going on, because we're too close to it, because it's our life, right? And here's where you begin to see this. Have you ever had a moment where you look back and there's something that happened in your life that in the moment was a tragic circumstance, or the moment was a really hard time, the moment was like really difficult, and now you look back now and you're like, hey, man, I'm so glad that happened. You look back now and you're like, hey, if that hadn't happened, then this wouldn't have happened, and that's one of the best things that's happened to me, right? You look back, and that moment, you look back in your life, and you begin to see with clarity that moment that looked seemingly really dark was actually a really great moment. I think about going back to my freshman year in college. I was trying so desperately to be a college golfer, and I thought, this is what I wanted to be. This is what I deeply desire, and I began to pray prayers, and they're very manipulative prayers, but God, when I get famous, I will point all the glory to you, right? I'll say it's because of God. I'll pray prayers for every birdie, right? That's going to be how it's going to operate, and God, if you'll just do this, this is going to be how this works out. And I just had all of this thing, and I began to say, hey, God, this is where this needs to be. And, and I just wanted this so bad, and I wanted God to show up, and I began to pray prayers. Hey, I have an issue here, and the issue is talent. And so if you could do something about that, God, if you could do something to the 8 guys that I'm going to take to be out of the picture before I get on the team. I don't know what it's going to take. We don't want to kill them, but maybe just an injury, that allows me to do that. God, whatever it takes, right? So this is this place. But I look back, my freshman year of college, man, God did an incredible thing in my life. God took me and just became incredibly personal. I began to follow God in a radical way in my freshman year, and it set me on the trajectory for the rest of my life. There's things that God did in my freshman year that set a trajectory for the rest of my life, and I'm here right now because of that moment. I would not be here if He'd have answered that prayer, and He would have given me the desires of my heart is to play college golf, right? Much less than what God wanted. But I was terrible at interpreting my circumstances. And so I arrived at college bummed, trying to figure out what's my identity? Well, who am I supposed to be now? What does this all mean? And in that moment, it seemed like a devastating place. But I look back and say, that was the most loving thing that God could have done. And there's circumstances that you can look back into in your life now. And you're like, you know what? If God had done what I asked Him to do, then this would have been really, really poor. Before your time, there was a great theologian by the name of Garth Brooks who wrote a song saying, thank God for unanswered prayers, right? Yeah, entertainer of the year, right? And theologian. And this is the thing. We don't know in the moment what God is up to. That we don't understand that we're terrible at being the interpreter of the events of our lives. The other thing that makes us really bad interpreters is this. Not only do we not see the context, we don't get God's timeline. That oftentimes we begin to think, hey, I have a timeline and God has a radically different timeline. And so when God's timeline doesn't fit our timeline, we just want God to fit into our time frames. And so we begin to say, I don't know if I can trust you. And this is where we get to look at the Bible and we begin to see, and this is how I hope you draw near to God and begin to see who He is, because their story, maybe it's the longest story of a single person in the entire Bible, the story of Joseph. And this guy is betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and then he's thrown into prison, falsely accused. And this dude stays faithful, and he stays confident in who God is. But you begin to look at what happens over and over in his life, and it gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. But he stays faithful to God, and over the period of about 15 years, everything goes bad. Would you have the faith that if everything went bad for 15 years, that you would stay faithful to God? And ultimately it works out, and He's pivotal to the entire story of the Bible. It's how Israel gets into Egypt, that ultimately they begin to, through the great flood, right? Or not the flood, the great parting of the sea, of the Red Sea, and they begin to escape. And it's the foundational story that points the way to Jesus, right? And it's because this guy stayed faithful for 15 years. We'd have difficulty staying faithful for 15 days. God, I need her to say yes when I ask her out. I'm going to give you 2 weeks. And then I'm going to become an atheist if not, right? This is really the thing. My time frame, God, if you can't do it in 10 weeks, you are no God at all, right? And so this is what we begin to see, that God begins to use this. Not only that, is that we begin to mistake experiences for the foundations of our faith. See, here's what the reality is, that God, for many of us, God will use an event or a circumstance to launch our faith. That He'll use an experience or a moment. And maybe you've had a moment where you were in a place and you were in a time and you were just inspired, and all of a sudden you saw clearly that maybe you went to church camp, or maybe you were in this place and you're in worship and it just was overwhelming for you, and there's an experience that you had and there was something that you clung to, and then you begin to go back to that and you begin to say, man, I need this moment, and you begin to chase after moment after moment after moment, and you think, hey, this is what my faith needs to be built upon. See, God uses circumstances and experiences and moments to launch our faith, but here's what can happen is oftentimes we begin to go back and say, that's the foundation from our faith. We begin to lean our faith against this idea of finding these moments and in these experiences. And then what happens is when the moment doesn't inspire us enough, when the circumstance isn't replicated, it moves and our faith falls, and we begin to say, that must have just been an anomaly, or I must have just projected upon God what I was feeling, but it can't be real because you founded your faith on an experience or a circumstance, but it wasn't something that would ultimately hold up. I want you to get that your faith is built on something, and you need to understand what that something is. You need to understand that the pleasures of life and the pressures of life can lead you, when you build your faith on that, to a circumstantial faith. Let me get you this. A guy named Andy Stanley says it this way: the pleasures of life will eventually cause every single aspect of your belief system to become inconvenient. Ew, that's a knife, right? The pleasures of life will eventually cause every single aspect of your belief system to become inconvenient. I want you to get that this is the case. That all of a sudden, when you begin to have a belief system and you begin to say, well, I want to do that, at some point you'll have to figure out that in order to continue to believe, you will have to do this. You will have to give up pleasure. And if your faith is built on circumstances, you will opt for pleasure every single time, and you will adjust your belief system to fit your behavior. And that's not a problem except for this. It means that what you've believed isn't really worth believing. And if you believe something today, it's likely that's not really what you're going to believe tomorrow. And that's not a problem except for this. When there's a moment that happens where you need to rely upon your faith, when there's a moment coming where the major thing happens, what your faith is sitting on, what's the foundation of your faith, what it's leaning against, if it's movable, then your faith crumbles. And you end up in a free fall. You end up in a dark spot. You end up in a place where you're like, I don't know what to believe. And there's not a whole lot scarier than having this moment where what you thought was true, that you start to believe that it's not true anymore. There's not a whole lot scarier to that. And here's the reality. When that happens, you need something that's going to hold you up. You need something that's going to be consistent. And here is what's radically different about Christianity than any other belief system, than any other kind of philosophy, than anything else. And this is what I love about what we believe, is that what we found Christianity on, what's the alternative to circumstantial faith, is something significantly different. And that's the intro to point us to Hebrews 4, verses 14. And this is going to show us the alternative to circumstantial faith. Here's what it says. It says, therefore, it's talking about all this text in front of this 4 chapters of building up as we begin to point to this. Since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Now, it's really simple today. We're just going to get into one verse, but I want you to see this really clearly now. I want you to understand what's going on. You see, the book of Hebrews in the Bible was written to this group of Jewish Christians, and here they are after Jesus has come and he has ascended back into heaven, and there's this clarity that God is coming back, but here's what's happening. The circumstances of their life are beginning to press in on them, that being a Jewish Christian is causing them to have all kinds of difficult things that have happened, that they begin to have things that they're having to sacrifice for, and they have things that they're working in that is difficult for them to be able to see. And the writer of Hebrews is helping them to say, hey, this is not about the circumstances, this is about the person of Jesus. And so in this verse, it's this clarifying statement that this isn't about a circumstance, this is about a person. So here's what we begin to see. It starts off with us beginning to see this is the conclusion. Since we have in the present tense, this is a current thing, which means you can put your hope, your faith, your confidence in this. Since we have, the next words are a great high priest. Now, this might not mean anything to you. You're coming into this without maybe a background in Jewish thought or this. Really what a high priest was this mediator between the people and between God. And God and people, there's this separation that everyone was really clear on. And what ultimately was the original system was there was this human that was appointed to be this conduit or this mediator between people and God. And this priest basically connected God to the people. But God's mission was this, that at some point in time, he was going to send his only son in flesh, God incarnated into this world, And he was going to live this sinless life and ultimately die, be buried, and resurrect. And ultimately, that was going to be the last high priest because he would forever change this and give people access to a holy God through his sacrifice on a cross, through his sinless life being sacrificed that paid the penalty for our sins that separated us from God. And ultimately, it was him who is the great high priest. It was the last high priest. And so we don't believe any more priests are needed because Jesus was the last one. This is what we understand, and this is what we believe, and this is what Jesus has done. And this next part of this, it says this, and he ascended into heaven. Now, it would be really easy for us to just go through here and says, therefore, since we have such a great high priest who ascended into heaven, but this is a key thing for you to understand because this clarifies and separates why you should have faith and the foundation of your faith and how it's different from anything else, because the idea of the fact that Jesus, who came to earth, ultimately ascended into heaven really clarifies that there is something that happened, that God sent Jesus into the world to accomplish his mission. And this is the one, he made him to be one of us. He lived in this world, he was died, and then what is clear is he resurrected. That this is different than anything else. There's people who have died for their faith, but here's what Jesus did. He came back from the dead. That he overcame sin and death. That he beat death with his own death. That he overcame this thing and his resurrection from the dead. This is what no one else has done, right? That he showed he had power over death. And this is the thing that happened. This is the event that happened. We have a person in history who showed up in our midst, lived a life, died, and was resurrected. The foundation of our faith is a person, is an event that this person achieved, not an experience or an answer to prayer. I want you to get that. Our faith is not built upon an experience. It's not based on an answer to prayer. It's based on this reality that 2,000 years ago, something happened. That there was an event that happened, and we can begin to say, this is why we have faith that is unshakable. This is why we can have confidence. And you might say, well, the history of that event might be unreliable. Here's what you cannot deny. That there was a group of people around Jesus. And it says this, after he rose again, it wasn't a secret. He began to show what he did to crowds up to 500 people. And what happened with that is it radically changed their faith system. It radically changed the confidence that they had. And this group of people, it began to change the world. And the world has never been the same because of this group of people. And what they pointed back to was not that they had a circumstantial faith, that God answered all these prayers or made their life easy, that there was a lot of pleasure and not a whole lot of pressure, that they could look back, because here's the thing, they were persecuted, they were killed. That's inconvenient, right? That's not a pleasure of this world to lose your life, right? There's all this stuff that happened. There's things that they expected, right? That God didn't do in the way that they expected. But here's the thing, it didn't change their faith. Because their faith was in a person, not in a circumstance. I want you to get that. That we don't have a faith system because, hey, this is just a really helpful way to see the world. That here we are humans and we have this kind of a conscience, that we kind of know something, that we know we exist, and Christianity is just a great way to help us to have a worldview that clarifies how we exist. No, who cares? There's a lot of other religions that have the exact same understanding of you just pick whatever situation that you want. Christianity is different because it is based and it is founded, and our faith is based upon a person, not a circumstance, and not just a person, what that person achieved, that God is who he says he is, and he accomplished what he said he was going to accomplish by Jesus in his resurrection from the dead. And so here's what we begin to see, the last part of that. And so here's what we do. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Why do we hold firmly to this? Why is it that God, when we hold firmly not to our circumstance, but the author and perfecter of our faith, that we hold tightly to the person as our foundation, that what that does is that allows us to go through life. And no matter how difficult the circumstance, no matter how bad it is, no matter how hard it gets, our faith doesn't budge. And these are the people ultimately that create movements. These are the people who change the world. Because here's what Jesus said, hey, in your life, there's going to have troubles. In your life, there's going to be difficult things. He's not trying to pull punches on us. He's just trying to say, hey, in your life, you've got to found it on the right thing. And I love this reality because we can look back and we can believe that 2,000 years ago, something happened. And it's not based upon, that's the foundation of our faith, not the capacity that we have to interpret our circumstances right. Here's the beauty of what Jesus has done. That God says, hey, I love you enough that all you have to do is that you have to put your hope and your trust and your faith in my son, Jesus Christ, not in some ability to interpret your circumstances, not in your ability to be, okay, I've got to take the bigger picture here and I have to be able to manage this so I can kind of boost up my faith, so I can make sure that I pump up my faith. I need to be able to have the right time frame, and I need to be able to see this in the right lens throughout all of this stuff. That doesn't really matter. All you have to do is put your hope in Jesus. And this is what I love about God. He doesn't make it complex. He just said, I sent my son. And if you put your faith in him, it radically changes the context of your life. And I love these realities that, and I honestly do. I don't want to make fun of this, but people who pray, man, I really needed this thing to happen. So I prayed for this. And then boom, God answered it immediately. Or, man, I was going through this hard time, and so I started praying and I started asking God. And then all of a sudden, he gave me more than I asked for. He gave me more than I wanted. It was like this incredible provision, right? And so, man, I desperately needed her to say yes. And so I prayed, and she said yes. Praise, miracle of all miracles, right? That God showed up, and now I have this incredible faith, right? We need to pray big prayers. I'm not saying to do this, but it's a slippery slope, isn't it? For us to begin to say, oh, now I trust in God because he showed up in the answer to this prayer. Oh, now I have faith because he did this thing for me. Here's what I want to challenge you. What if God didn't do anything else for you? What if there's no prayer that God answered the way that you wanted him to answer for the rest of your life? And what God did was ultimately save you and give you an eternity through his son, Jesus Christ. Is that enough for you? Is that enough for your faith? Can you have a white-hot faith if the circumstances of your life are terrible? And it seems like God allows that to happen. That's a different kind of faith. But I wanted you to know that's a faith that you can ultimately trust. That's a faith that's never going to move. That's a faith that's never going to fail you. That's a foundation that isn't going to wreck you. And you're not ever going to have a moment where you begin to say, man, what I thought my foundation was, what I thought I had confidence in, the floor just dropped out from under me. You will never have that. See, what I love is I love the people who pray. And it's like, God, we ask you to heal this person, but even if you don't, God, we wanted you to show up and change this circumstance, and you didn't, and it didn't change at all because my faith isn't in the circumstances, my faith is in a person. That maybe my job, maybe I lost this and it wasn't my fault and you didn't show up and you didn't rescue me, but it doesn't change my faith because my faith isn't in a job. My faith isn't in a prayer that gets answered in a certain way that I want it to be answered. My faith is in a person. And so I want you to get that your faith is being molded, that God is doing something, and he's sending and pointing people's eyes to faith in his son, not faith in their circumstances. And this is what God is doing to build your faith. He's continuing to not point to changing your circumstances as much as he's helping you to see his son. And the more that you can be able to understand that God is at work helping you to see his son and not just change your circumstances, and he may change your circumstances, don't stop praying. But I need you to get that your faith has to be founded upon something that's more significant than that. And for you to be able to say, man, I know that God loves me, and I know that he is working for my good, not just because he's changing the circumstances, but because he showed his love by sending his one and only son onto this earth for me to ultimately pay the price that I had to pay for my life, the price for the sin that separated us. And so in this, the writer of Hebrews, it tells us what to do. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says this, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, that we are to fix our eyes upon Jesus, that in all the craziness of life, that in all the difficulty of life, that what we are to do is to not look at our circumstances and ask, is God good? But we are to look at Jesus and say, is God good? Is God worth my hope, my trust, my confidence? And as you begin to see this, it changes everything about it. See, here's what I want to get to. Each and every one of us in this room, to some extent, have a circumstantial faith. And this is what God is working to change. That for some of you, your entire faith system has been built upon your ability to interpret your circumstances. And maybe this today is the first time that you've heard that that's not actually the way that you have faith. And let me press just a little bit further. For some of you, you've never put your faith in Jesus. You call yourself a Christian. You would say, this is what I believe, but actually your belief is in what God is going to do in your circumstances. And so even today, I want to challenge you to maybe for the first time, put your belief in Jesus. To maybe just today you'd say, I'm going to, for the first time maybe, and maybe you've been around Christianity for a while, but for the first time you say, it's not about my circumstances. It's not about my pleasure. It's not about the pressures. It's about the person of Jesus. And this is that thing that you begin to say, maybe today for the first time you make that decision to follow Jesus in a way that you've never made before because you followed after a circumstance. And that circumstance one day will end up being fragile and be wrecked. But today you can have something that's never going to fail you, and that's Jesus Christ. Maybe some of you here, you've gone through the difficult times and you get tempted and you arrive in college, you arrive in this context, and all of a sudden you're tempted to have your behavior change your belief system because it's a real temptation to put your hope in a circumstance and not a person of Jesus Christ. And for all of this, Lord, I want to ask us just to think through this prayer. Lord, give me white-hot faith in you. Help me to see the pleasures and the pressures that turn my eyes away from you and turn them to my circumstances. And so I want us to respond, and I want us to begin to think through, do I have a faith that's placed in Jesus? Or if I'm really honest, do I have a faith that ebbs and flows based upon the circumstances and my ability to see God in my life? So we start off this and begin to say, what does it look like? And what do we have confidence in? What is it founded on?